Welcome to the No Shame Podcast. This is John Groders, and this is where you're going to hear incredible stories from amazing people who live lives of faithfulness right in the smack dab middle of modern secular culture. Today's guest is Tim Barton of the American think tank called WallBuilders.
Have no shame, no, we are not afraid, no shame.
Hi, I'm John Groders, and this is the No Shame Podcast, and today we welcome Tim Barton from WallBuilders, and I'm super excited about this session, Tim, because I can't wait to learn a little bit from you and your organization in this next half hour or so. And if you wouldn't mind, just start off, just give us the general overview. What is WallBuilders, and what do you guys do?
Absolutely. And first of all, it's a pleasure being with you. Thanks for having me on the podcast today. WallBuilders is a unique name. It actually comes from a Bible book from Nehemiah. It's a little funny these days because oftentimes people think if we're wall builders, then we're connected with the Trump campaign. Maybe we're doing something on the southern wall, which is not correct at all. But rather, in the Bible book of Nehemiah saw the walls of Jerusalem that had been torn down. He was in captivity and really felt impressed on his heart that he needed to go back and have those walls rebuilt. And so the book of Nehemiah is kind of the story of Nehemiah embarking on this journey to rebuild the walls of his nation. And when we look at our nation today, my dad is the one that started our organization, WallBuilders, and he looked at the nation and saw that the religious, the moral, the constitutional heritage had really been torn down. Those walls had kind of crumbled, and so he just felt impressed that we wanted to see those moral, those religious and spiritual, that constitutional wall rebuilt in our nation to kind of give some more strength and security to our nation. And so that's where the name WallBuilders comes from. And what we've done as an organization for nearly 30 years is we've tried to present America's forgotten history and her heroes, things that most people today just don't know very much about, although historically it's very well documented. It's easy to point back to the founders' original writings and their life and who they were and what they did. And so that's what we try to do is show the foundation that our nation was built on and some of those key principles that have led us to be one of the most successful nations in the history of the world.
It's very interesting that you connect that with Nehemiah. I mean, Jerusalem had been destroyed by an alien invader. I mean, this is after the Babylonians, right? And Nehemiah is got a vision to restore Jerusalem to what it once was. That's kind of, I get you why you have that name. That's fantastic.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's one of those things that actually, as our culture increasingly is becoming biblically illiterate, the name certainly doesn't have the same connection. It doesn't resonate with most people, even Christians today. You know, most Christians don't even know the Bible very well anymore, and so it really does take some explanation. But obviously, you're someone who knows the story, and when you know the story, you go, "Oh, I can see that," and really, it's something that I think when most Christians hear the story, it resonates with them that, yeah, you know, we want to see truth. We want to see morality come back to our nation, those constitutional principles. But that is where the name comes from.
Well, if you're dialing into the No Shame Podcast today, I just encourage you to either make sure your drive is long enough to stick with us or just pull over right now on the side of the road and just stop and listen, because you'd have to go to a college course or invite one of these guys to come and speak at your organization. But I'm fascinated by American history, Tim, and I would love to hear everything you guys have to say. But if we could just sort of divide our time into America yesterday, America today, America tomorrow, it's pretty basic. But let's start with America yesterday. You guys are experts on what this country was founded on, what its principles were. And like you guys point out, man, you might not get taught that anymore in school. You might not get that in your public school. You might not even get that in your elite college university. So just, man, what started this country and what was unique that separated us from the other nation states in the world?
That's a great question. And actually, let me first kind of give a nod to, as you mentioned, a lot of people don't know some of the information that is very historically evident. One of the things that's a problem in education today is that education today, instead of telling the whole story, right? Like historically, when you look back, even if you go to Bible history, the Bible is a great example because people that are held up in the Bible to be heroes, the Bible is still very honest about who they were in their life. The Bible tells the good, the bad, and the ugly. And King David's a great example. When you look at King David, the Bible holds him up as a hero, right? He's a hero of faith. He was someone who's a man after God's own heart. Arguably, there was no greater worshiper or even warrior in biblical history, and yet, beyond the good of David, right, where David had killed the lion and the bear, where David killed Goliath, there's a lot of good associated with David. There's also some bad. When you look at David as a father, he really wasn't a good father, right? Where his kids turned on each other, his kid, just a lot of depravity, right, from David's kids. And then you have David in the affair with Bathsheba, and not only does he have the affair with Bathsheba, he murders her husband Uriah, but the Bible shows us the whole picture of the good, the bad, the ugly. With American history, the way it's largely presented today is we try to present the bad and the ugly, but we don't present very much good. And so most people today can say more things that are wrong with America than things that are good about America, because we simply don't learn the positive aspects of what America was or even what she still is in many regards. And so this is what we try to do is we're not trying to tell a different narrative. We're just trying to tell more of a complete story. Because certainly when you look historically, there's some atrocities that have happened in America, right? Whether you look at slavery or whether you look at some of the relations with certain individuals and Indians, you can look historically and you can find the flaw in humanity in every civilization and every society. Well, that's no exception in America. In America, there were fallen human beings just like any other nation, but America was so unique because unlike other nations, America was founded on the principle of religious liberty, of religious tolerance, and of freedom. When you look at the people that were early coming to America, the Pilgrims are a great example. The Pilgrims were actually Christians in England at the time, and at the time in England there was a state-established church, and the state-established church wanted everybody to be a part of whatever denomination, whatever the practices were that the king had enforced, and the Pilgrims said, we really don't see things the way that the king sees things. And so they left England, they went to Holland to try to raise their kids in Holland, and along the way raising their kids in Holland, they realized that our kids are growing up in a secular nation, and even though we're not being persecuted for our faith in Holland like we were in England, they're still not learning the things we want them to learn. They said we should go to a different place where we can make it a Christian society, and that's what ultimately led the Pilgrims to come to America. Well, when you go through the history of immigration in America, especially in the 16 and 1700s, America was heavily populated by people that were escaping state-run religions and state-run churches and kings that were very oppressive and using religion to be oppressive, and they came to America seeking religious liberty, religious freedom. And one of the things that we can even point to in America that is so unique, there's so many things about America that we do directly because of the Bible, and most people don't recognize that because if we looked at something today and said, why do we have a Republican form of government? People wouldn't instantly go, well, the Bible. But if you back up historically, when the Pilgrims get to America, they're one of the first ones to start this Republican notion of government. And what they did is they said, in America, we're going to make sure that we're not going to have some lord noble, some king over us who is telling us what to do. And they had elections every single year, and they elected two people. They elected a governor and they elected a pastor. And maybe for some, if they're Christians, they're going, that's kind of weird that every year you elect a pastor. But the idea for the Pilgrims was they wanted to make sure that they had two separate institutions, that the governor couldn't do what the pastor did, the pastor wasn't the governor, and so they separated what ultimately originally was known as the separation of church and state. It was two separate institutions, but the reason they did that is because the Bible they were using was the Geneva Bible, and the Geneva Bible was the Bible that came out of the Reformation. The early reformers wrote a lot of commentary explaining the Bible. Now it was in the language of common man, and people are reading it for the first time, and they didn't really know what it was about, so they wrote commentary. Well, the Geneva Bible took commentary from these early reformers, and so as you're reading the Bible, it would have commentary on the side explaining what those verses, what that passage meant. Well, this is what the Pilgrims brought to America. Well, the Geneva Bible was very much anti a lot of the practices of the king. In fact, the Geneva Bible would even point out that a king was never God's idea, right? If you go back to 1 Samuel.
Give us a
right,
king.
where,
okay.
Yeah.
Right.
The people said, hey, we want a king. And Samuel says, that's a terrible idea,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like, you're not going to like this at all.
Right.
You're going to lose everything, your sons, your daughters, your property. Well, as the reformers pointed out, God was not in favor of a king. It was the people, and so God finally, right, he acquiesced. He gave the people what they were asking for, but he said, you're not going to like this. And so the reformers and the pilgrims, they asked the question of, if God never intended for there to be a king, what was God having the Israelites do before there was a king? And they backed up to Exodus 18, to Deuteronomy chapter 1 and Deuteronomy chapter 16, all of which say that you need to choose from among you leaders to represent you.
Yeah.
Well, this was the origins of a Republican form of government, but the reason it's significant is because if you look at European history at the time when the Pilgrims come to America, who else at that time in the world is electing their governing officials? Nobody.
Right.
The reason we did it in America is because the Bible, I can go through dozens of examples that have shaped the way we operate and function as a nation. The reason that we have religious liberty in America, most nations of the world don't have religious liberty. In fact, even today, if you go to Saudi Arabia and try to practice your faith, Saudi Arabia is recognized as an industrialized, stable, free nation, and free being relative, right? But that's how they're recognized in the world. Do you know they don't allow Christians to have the same freedom that they would maybe their own kind of fundamental religion of Islam, right? Muslims have the freedom. Christians don't. You go to China. Christians don't have the same freedom there. You can look at these major world power nations, right, top nations of the world, and they don't have the same freedom that we have in America. Well, where do we come up with the idea of freedom? Well, if you go back to the Garden of Eden, God gave everybody a choice all the time. Mm-hmm. God told Adam and Eve, right, here's what I want you to do, but you can choose, right? Like, eat from all these trees, not that one, but God gave them a choice. When Joshua leads the Israelites into Canaan, he says, choose this day who you will serve, right? As for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. It's very fascinating looking back historically at how much of what we did was shaped because of the Bible, and actually there's been many presidents that even pointed to this, people that today we might not look at and think of in such ways, but if you go to example to somebody like FDR, so FDR, who obviously is not one of the more conservative presidents we've had, right? Where Franklin Roosevelt, very liberal guy, very big government guy, but he says in the formative days of the Republic, the directing influence the Bible exercised upon the fathers of the nation is conspicuously evident. He said, we cannot read the history of our rise and development as a nation without reckoning with the place the Bible has occupied in shaping the advances of the Republic. FDR said, you can't read history and not see how the Bible shaped America. Now, I would argue today, you could read almost any history book and you won't see how the Bible shaped America, but FDR is not that long ago. Right? I mean, this is 2 generations ago. He says, you can't read a history book and not see how the Bible shaped America. So what that tells me is either we don't know the Bible well enough to recognize the specific things we do in our nation that come from the Bible, or we don't actually know real history to be able to point to historically and go, oh, that's where they use the Bible, and that's where they use the Bible, because FDR, a very liberal guy, even FDR says, no, it's obvious the Bible has shaped America and what we do in America, and yet today it's just not very obvious anymore.
You know, I believe that God's orders, God's laws, God's commandments, anything that is instruction, is never meant to sort of please God's sense of rule maker, but it's suggested to the creation because it's the best way to live. You know, that's how I think that, you know, God's teaching on marriage leads to the best marriages. God's teaching on, you know, societal relationships. Don't steal. Don't, you know, covet.
Absolutely.
And so for government to be built on, as you're teaching us, that the very principles of choice, the very principles of freedom come right out of Genesis and then right into Exodus and Deuteronomy. It's no surprise, is it, that America, with that as its basis, had prosperity for hundreds of years?
No, it's really not. You know, one of the things, even as you're mentioning Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, there was a study done that it was actually done by several professors. I think LSU, by professors from Houston University, but they decided they wanted to look back and see how the founding fathers were really influenced. And so they took, I think it was 13,000 writings, just kind of selective sample writings from the founding era, and it was from before the Declaration up through the Constitution. And they went through and they looked through these thousands of writings. And what their goal was every time they found a quote or, a quotation, a citation, they just wanted to see who these guys were quoting, what really influenced them the most. And what they found was the number one cited individual was Charles Montesquieu. And I think it was 8.3% of the quotes that they found were from Charles Montesquieu. The second was Blackstone, who was William Blackstone. He's the guy that wrote the Commentaries on the Laws of England, a very influential work for the Founding Fathers and a lot of their government work. But 7.9% of the quotes came from Blackstone. John Locke came in third. John Locke's the guy that wrote the two treatises of government. 2.9% of the quotes came from him. And then it goes down from there. So those are the top three cited individuals. Now, those are the top three cited individuals, but that's not the top cited source that these professors found. The professors found that 34% of all quotes from the Founding Fathers, from all these writings, came from the Bible.
Wow.
Which is really fascinating because today, right, people would argue, wait a second, the Founding Fathers weren't religious, right? These guys were atheists or agnostics or deists. And yet if you look back historically, it's so easy to show it's not true. But even more specifically, if you look at the books that were quoted the most, even from the Bible, Deuteronomy was the most quoted book in the founding era from the Bible. And Deuteronomy is where Moses is recounting a lot of the laws that God has given the Israelites as they're about to go into Canaan to be successful. And this is what the Founding Fathers are quoting the most, pointing back to Deuteronomy, saying, well, here's what the Bible says, and they're actually applying it in how they live their life and even how they shape their nation, which, this today would just blow people's mind. It's so counterintuitive based on what we've been told, and yet it's historically documented evidence. And as I'm saying this, just in case listeners aren't familiar with WallBuilders and even some of the work we do historically, we have what's considered one of the largest private collections of original writings and documents from the founding era. We have tens of thousands of original documents and writings from journals to actual letters to proclamations. And so as we're saying, we can point to the fact that the Founding Fathers, that our nation was built on the Bible. The Founding Fathers used the Bible to build our nation. This is not just some subjective thought we have. We actually have the letters and the journals and the writings and the proclamations that point to the Bible. And this is why we would argue it's very well historically documented, because there's literally thousands of documents that point to this. And yet we don't talk about this in history today, right? We don't highlight these events and facts. And it's even interesting, the Founding Fathers made an argument when we become a nation, there's no Department of Education, and which, the federal government does a lot of stuff today that the Founding Fathers never really intended for them to do, but there was no Department of Education, so every state's in charge of their own education. But there was some Founding Fathers concerned that maybe states, since every state's in charge of their own education, they might not all have the same standard. So one of the Founding Fathers, one of the most significant Founding Fathers, was a guy named Benjamin Rush, and it's a name that many people have never heard of today. He signed the Declaration. He helped ratify the Constitution. He is a guy who served on 3 different presidential administrations. He was director of the U.S. Mint. He's considered the father of American medicine. He's considered the father of public schools under the Constitution. He started one of the first Bible societies. Actually, he and Benjamin Franklin started the first abolition society in America in 1774, fighting against slavery. I mean, the guy's resume is just almost unbelievable, right? It's so amazing. But what he did is he wrote several essays dealing with education. And there was one he wrote in 1791. It was called A Defense of the Use of Bible in Schools. And his argument was that no matter what state you are in, one of the top priorities you should have in your school would be the Bible. And part of the argument he makes is that our nation is built on giving freedom to people. But freedom only works if you have a moral people, right? Because and it makes sense. If you give freedom to immoral people, they do immoral things. So you have to have a moral people. And he explains, but you only get morality through religion. And really, the best religion is through the Bible. So the Bible has to be taught if we are going to be a free nation. He actually even goes so far as to say, if we neglect the instruction of the Bible to our youth, he says, I lament that we will spend so much time and money punishing crimes, and we have taken so little pains to prevent them. We profess to be a Christian republic nation, and yet we have neglected the one book, the one means which will preserve our republic, the use of the Bible.
What you're saying, Tim, is so important. You know, you're listening to the No Shame podcast. My guest today is Tim Barton from WallBuilders, and Tim is right. From Benjamin Rush to Benjamin Franklin to the Founding Fathers, who are reading Montesquieu and Blackstone, they're reading Locke, but they're basing a new society on the Bible. Deuteronomy is when the Israelites are setting up a new society, but Deuteronomy also carries a warning, which is, you know, when you get to the promised land, when you start to live in houses you didn't build, when you start to drink from cisterns you didn't dig, you will forget me. And where are we at today? You know, you just said Benjamin Rush was saying we should never neglect the teaching of Bibles in schools. Tim, my son Jed, when he graduated high school, was valedictorian. He was denied the right to speak at his school because he wanted to quote from 1 Corinthians chapter 10.
Wow.
And so our public school denied him the chance to give a valedictorian address based on that would be a violation of the First Amendment. So where are we today?
Yeah, you know, it's so interesting the way the First Amendment is interpreted based on how it's written, right? Because the Founding Fathers wrote that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. But the first couple words are the most important. Who does the First Amendment limit? Congress.
Yeah. And
how does it limit them? Congress shall make no law. I fail to see how your son wanting to mention a Bible verse is Congress making a law, right? Like,
I thought the same thing.
How in the world do you misinterpret it that badly? And yet, this
nor
is what
prohibiting the
done.
free exercise thereof. It's actually blatantly stated.
Right. You've done the exact opposite.
Yeah.
And this is where what's interesting. So kind of the way it's interpreted in modern era is there was a case back in 1947, Everson versus Board of Education. And what happened is there was a Justice Hugo Black who said what we've done is we've always applied this Jefferson separation of church and state clause to the free exercise, which meant that Congress, that the government had to protect religion, right? It could never restrict religion. He says, but I think we've misapplied that separation. So instead of the separation being that government can never tell your son no if he wants to pray at his graduation, they said we really ought to apply it to the Establishment Clause. And so what government really should be concerned with is not protecting the free exercise of religion, but rather the government should be more concerned with stopping the establishment of religion, because that's what's more dangerous. Mm-hmm. And so the government then shifted their idea, and the courts are the ones that shifted that idea, but the courts have said that now if someone has a religious activity, and if they engage in that in public where other people can hear it, that is that person trying to establish a national religion, and therefore the government is compelled to stop that religious activity because your son was clearly trying to establish a religion when he was going to give that speech you mentioned a verse. Now, that's about as ludicrous an argument as you can imagine, and yet that's what the U.S. Supreme Court said. And so modern precedent is largely shaped on that. Now, with that being said, there are some amazing groups that defend religious liberty, some legal law firms, groups like First Liberty and Kelly Shackelford, or you have groups like Liberty Counsel with Matt Staver, Alliance Defending Freedom, and they have a whole slew of guys, Alliance Defending Freedom or Pacific Justice Institute, we can go down the list. There's some really great organizations, and the only thing they do is fight and defend religious freedom. One of the groups that we're very closely connected with is First Liberty, and Kelly Shackelford is the CEO, the president of that organization. And they boast over a 90% win ratio when it comes to religious liberty cases, and actually they defend people for free. So I wish we would have been connected back when your son was fighting this battle as a senior in high school, because there are these groups that will step in and they really will put the school in their place, because they'll say, no, wait, that's not what the First Amendment says. Well, the reason they have this amazing win ratio is because history and historical precedent and even original intent is on our side, and courts recognize that. The problem is most people are just not informed enough to know that when someone says, wait, you can't do that in public, actually legally I can, and if you oppose me, you're going to lose. But most schools are so scared of lawsuits that instead of letting a kid have their free exercise, or even better, have the freedom of speech, instead of letting them practice the First Amendment, they're so scared that they're going to get sued by some atheist or some secular group or the ACLU. They say, oh, no, we can't let you pray because, it's against the First Amendment. We're going to get sued. It's really not. But the problem with the modern culture and kind of the where we are today, right? So historically, we look back, we were shaped by the Bible. Today, we're saying the Bible is bad. And the reason we're very anti-religious today is because people don't know what history says. They don't know what the Founding Fathers did. They don't know original intent. And they only know what their history teacher or what their professor tells them today. And oftentimes what the history teacher professor tells them today just simply isn't true, but because we don't know enough history or even legal precedent, we don't recognize the flaw. And so unfortunately, a lot of times we allow bad things to happen just because we don't stand up and oppose it.
Yeah. I've been reading the Federalist papers. You talk about bright guys in their day. We look back and there's some sort of a sense that, well, because we think our athletes are bigger and faster and stronger today, that we might be more intellectually superior than ages past. Reading historical documents, reading first editions of their actual writings, it will blow your mind, the level of insight and education and how well read so many of the founding fathers were. And lately there's been this sort of sense, well, if America is exceptional, here's why. It's because it's got two borders that are oceans that can't be crossed. It's because we've got incredible natural resources. Tim, I go to the border between San Diego and Tijuana. And, if you cross the border between San Diego and Tijuana, you travel a mile, but you travel between two completely different worlds. And I'm not convinced there's any difference in the natural resources in the borders of the oceans between Tijuana and San Diego. I'm not convinced that it's some sort of natural genetic evolutionary power that makes the country to the north more prosperous. What is the difference that happens when you cross a border between Tijuana? It's the founding bedrock principles of the two countries, as I see it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think even North and South Korea are such an easy example of this, right? Because they were one nation, Korean War, they divided along the 30th parallel, but they have the same land, culture, heritage, natural resources. In fact, North Korea has better natural resources than South Korea.
Wow.
And yet, when you look at their governing philosophy, right, communism is always destructive, right, and socialism is just, right, it's the first step toward communism, right? So socialism isn't good either, but the idea of freedom and even protected freedoms. See, our nation was built on the philosophy outlined in the Declaration, where the Founding Fathers said that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they're endowed by their Creator with certain rights. What's amazing in the Declaration is that the Founding Fathers, Jefferson, the 33-year-old guy who's there putting this together, which is just amazing to think about. But Jefferson points out that there's a God, and that this God didn't intend for there to be a hierarchy of classes, which is still very common in many nations of the world today. No, God made us all his kids, and actually God gave us certain rights. And then he continues and says that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Government exists to protect our God-given rights. What's made America so unique and so free for so long is we've recognized our rights don't come from the government. Our rights come from God. Right. When you look at a place like North Korea will know the government's the one that gives you your rights. China, the government's the one that tells you what you can and can't do. In America, we said, no. God has given us our rights. Government, you cannot touch what God's given us. You can't touch, right, the freedom of religion, the freedom of speech. You can't touch my ability of self-defense. You can't touch my private property. We understood there's certain things God has given us that government can never interfere with, and it was the protection of that freedom from the oppressive government that has made us so unique and special. But kind of the moving forward, where do we go from here? If you look at our nation, will our nation continue to be free? The Founding Fathers said freedom only works if you have a moral people. Right. John Adams says our Constitution was only made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. His point is that if you try to use our Constitution over in Saudi Arabia or Iraq or Iran, it's never going to work. Mm-hmm. It's only built for a moral and religious people. Well, how do we explain that? Because our Constitution is based on giving freedom to we the people. We the people are in charge, but if we are an immoral people, freedom will not work. You need more government. You need more police officers. You need the militarized zones where they're going to enforce, because we no longer have inward morality, so we need someone to compel us outwardly with their guns and make us do the right thing. I really enjoy freedom, but the only way our nation will continue to be free is if we can go back to a moral foundation which has made us so special. And by the way, part of that moral foundation is built on the notion that there is a God. He's given us rights, and government's primary function is not to give us health care, it's to protect the rights God has already given us.
We're talking with Tim Barton from WallBuilders. Tim, we did a film this past year called Tortured for Christ. I spent much of the year in Romania. The film took place around the life of a man named Richard Wurmbrand and his wife Sabina, who were Christian pastors. And post-World War II, the Russians, the Soviets, just poured into the country of Romania and sort of took it over. And we saw firsthand, as I visited many of the prisons in that country and many locations, as we told the story of Richard Wurmbrand, who spent 14 years in communist prisons, tortured daily in the name of re-education to try to drive his faith in Christ out of his body. His resistance to that, his willingness to endure the punishment but never submit to hatred or to fear and to love his neighbors was a powerful story. And it brought me face to face with the brutality of communism, which is hand in hand with official atheism. So if you have official atheism, you essentially have the opposite of everything you've just been talking about.
You're exactly right. If there is no God, and in government, there's only two options. You either have a big God or you have a big government, right? For as far as philosophy for a nation. And if you're a communist nation, there is no God. Therefore, you will have a big, micromanaging, controlling government. But if your national philosophy, if your nation believes that there is a God, I don't need a really big government. I don't need a government to give rights to people. God's given those rights to people. I just need a government to protect the rights God's already given to the people. But you're right. This is kind of that philosophy of either you have a big God or a big government. And as a nation, in America, we're the ones that have always had the freedom to choose and elect those kind of leaders that represent our values. Well, unfortunately, we have a lot of leaders right now who don't believe there's a God who's given rights to men. They believe, no, the government needs to be the one to come and micromanage and control and run and dictate and do. And ultimately, this is why we're looking at our nation and going, oh, my gosh, we have some problems, and there's no doubt we have problems. But, even in the midst of saying there's problems, I always try to remind people that this is not a negative, discouraging, frustrating time. In fact, I would argue as a Christian, this is the best time ever to be alive in America because you have a culture that is hungry for truth. They are searching for answers, and God has given us the key to success in His Word, right? The biblical principles will help us be a success in our marriage, in our family, in our job, even as a nation. What we need are Christians who know the principles of the Word of God, who can promote that truth, because our culture is looking for answers, and we have been given every answer our culture needs. This is a great time to be alive. We just have to find those answers so we can present the truth to culture.
Well, I love your spirit, and it's an accurate one because there should be positive spirit that people of God carry. Isn't there a sense, Tim, that if I loved your statement, you have a big God or a big government. People who are really clamoring for bigger and bigger government often do it in the name of compassion. Well, we need more compassionate programs. We should let all the world's poor into our countries. We should feed and clothe and house everybody. You come to complete communist socialist philosophy. Has that worked historically? What has really benefited the lowest of the low and the poorest of the poor? What systems of government have actually proven themselves to work for them?
Yeah, there's a lot of irony even in that question because every single communist dictator at some point said, we are doing this for the good of the poor, the good of the needy. We are doing this, right? We're controlling your life. We're taking away your guns. We're doing this for the good of people. Every dictator has always said they're doing what they do for the good of people, right? The problem is, if you look at the 1900s, at the 20th century, communism has killed more people than basically every military conflict put together in world history. I mean, it's staggering what has happened to kill people. And yet you're right. If you look, again, North and South Korea is just such a prime example looking at what helps bring people out of poverty. North Korea has better natural resources. They have the same culture and heritage. They have everything and even more than what South Korea has. And yet South Korea has been incredibly prosperous. In fact, they're one of the top 10 economic producing nations in the world today, and it's built on the free market system, on giving freedom to people. Now, that used to be known as capitalism, but capitalism has become a very dirty word. So, right, saying the free market or free enterprise is maybe not as offensive to some people, but when you reward people based on their ability, based on their productivity, then you actually see people working to be more productive, working to increase their ability, and you see it actually raise the level of the society they live in. And in America, it's one of the things that, there's never been equality of outcome for anybody in any nation ever. That's never happened. Socialism does not bring equality of outcome. But in America, we actually have a nation that, even though there's not equality of outcome, there's equality of opportunity, that in America, anybody can become a doctor. Anybody can become a lawyer. Anybody can become an engineer. We don't limit it based on class, based on the color of somebody's skin, based on the shape of their body. Right? No. That has nothing to do in America. The free market, and this is beyond America, right? But the free market rewards people based on what they do and what they accomplish, not based on how they look, not based on the class they are in. And there's no doubt that the free market, and by the way, God actually has very, very well documented some of these economic principles, even in the Gospels, Jesus in the parables, right, where he teaches the parable of the minas and the parable of the talents, and he talks about that if somebody's productive, they should be rewarded more, and the people that are lazy shouldn't even receive. And 2 Thessalonians 3:10 says, if you don't work, you don't eat. The Bible deals with economic principles. God is so in favor of people taking the gifts and talents and abilities he's given them and being productive, but God also always judges people on an individual basis. 1 Timothy 5:8 says, if a man will not provide for his own family, he's worse than a non-believer. The Bible doesn't call us to provide for everybody else's family. Now, as individuals, the Bible does say if we see the poor and needy, we should help them. But the Bible never told government to help the poor and needy. In fact, the only thing the Bible ever tells the government in regard to the poor and needy is do not mistreat them when they go to court. Don't show favoritism even for them or against them when they go to court, but give them justice. We've just moved so far away from understanding even whose responsibility it is to care for the poor and needy. The Bible always indicated it was the individual, it was the family, or even the church's job. It was never the government's job. The government bears the sword. The family and the church, they don't. They have different responsibilities, but if we as individuals will say, hey, you know what, let's help people if they're in need, but let's also recognize that God has called us to be productive. Well, capitalism is a system that actually allows people to start off in abject poverty, and they can end their life in incredible wealth because if they work hard, if they achieve, if they're productive, then they get rewarded for that productivity. Socialism has never done that.
Some people remember the Berlin Wall and the separation of East and West Germany. The wall door only swung one way. Nobody was trying to get into East Germany. There's many examples, and as believers, that the idea that we are trying to bring about the kingdom of God on earth, and it is a beautiful kingdom, and it's filled with His love and mercy and opportunity, and everybody has value. But you bring up interesting reminders to us that there are ways that the Bible suggests and condones, and then there are ways that that they do not condone. And what you guys do at WallBuilders is make this really clear. I think in the last couple of minutes here, Tim, maybe just looking towards the future, what you sound like even in the midst of all the things that are troubling, you've got hope and optimism. What are the bases of those, and what do you most like to see people take away when they leave one of you guys' conferences or speeches or classes? What do you want them to hang on to most of all?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking that question, because that is something that we always want to concentrate on. What's the takeaway from this? And one of the things that we really encourage people is to be seekers of truth. Right. One of the things that Jesus said is, first of all, that He was truth. Right. John 14:6. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except through me. Truth does exist, and Jesus identifies that He is actually truth. Right. We find truth in God, but Jesus in John 8:32 said, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Truth brings freedom. And so often in culture today, we don't promote truth, we promote agenda, right? You can't turn on the news and discover truth anymore. You're going to hear somebody's opinion and somebody's agenda. And this is, generally across the board, right? It's not just the left or the right. No, pretty much everybody's trying to promote agenda over truth these days. And especially as Christians, we ought to be more concerned with not how do I feel, not what do I think, but what is true. And the truth of our nation is that we were founded on Judeo-Christian ethics, Judeo-Christian principles, and that our founding fathers, even though not every one of them was a Christian, all of them recognized the importance of the moral teachings found in the Bible, and that our nation needed to build on those philosophies and principles, and that would help us be successful. And the reason I can be so encouraged is not always because I look and go, man, the road ahead is just so easy and it's bright and shiny, but rather because I remember the kind of the principle you learned from going back in Numbers when the Israelites are about to go into Canaan, and there's 12 leaders chosen from the 12 tribes to go spy out the land. And they go and look at the land. This is what God has called us to. And so they're going to go check out and see what's there. And 10 of them come back, and you remember, they said, oh, no, it truly is land flowing with milk and honey. There's so much that are there, but there's these giants.
Giants everywhere,
right?
Yeah.
And they discourage the hearts of the people. And God actually brings judgment on those guys for that because they discourage the hearts of the people. But 2 guys, Joshua and Caleb, said, well, no, there are giants, but God has said he would give us a land. Let's go take it. And so it would be foolish for us to look at our nation and pretend like there aren't giants that we're trying to overcome and fight against, right? There's no doubt there are problems in our nation, but the thing as a Christian I'm always encouraged by is that, well, we're not doing this alone, right? Joshua and Caleb weren't thinking they're going to have to fight the giants by themselves. No,
right.
They knew whose side they were on. And this is where, as a Christian, I can look at our nation and go, you know what? God wants to reach the heart of every single person in our nation. God is the one who says truth matters. Jesus, right, said he is truth. So we're going to keep fighting for the nation that God's given us, which, by the way, we believe that's also part of stewardship, right? You read the parables from the Gospels and how often did Jesus leave, said, I'm going on a journey, but I'm leaving you in charge. You take care of this until I return. And then he returns and holds them accountable. We've been given a nation. And we believe we have to be good stewards even of what God has given us as a nation. But in the midst of this, again, we're not looking at this as those 10 leaders from the 10 tribes who said, oh my gosh, it's too big, it's too hard. No. Right? Jesus even said, what is impossible with man is possible with God. I'm encouraged because I'm not fighting this battle alone. And I can even say on a more practical front, I see so many Christians who are waking up and actually standing up to defend faith, to defend truth, to defend religious liberty, people that are voting that have never voted before. I see America waking up in a lot of regards, and it's good because there's some major battles we have to fight. And this is where I'm not discouraged by the battle because I know they're looking for truth, and we have truth, but it's time for Christians to really start standing up.
Well, if you're listening, this is the No Shame Podcast. You're on today with Tim Barton from WallBuilders, and this has been exactly what I thought it would be, just a whirlwind of encouragement and teaching and perspective that I just I'm fascinated by. I appreciate the breadth of your connections between founding documents, biblical principles. On your website, you've got this great Washington statement that says that the favorable smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation which disregards the eternal rules of order and right which heaven itself has ordained. You guys are fighting at WallBuilders to remind us what those rules of order and right which heaven has ordained are, so that we don't disregard them even for another day.
Yeah, and actually I would encourage people, check out our website, wallbuilders.com. We're also all over social media. We do a lot. Again, you just read a quote from George Washington from the original writings of these founding fathers showing not what we think they believed, but what they actually said they believed. And when you start studying their own writings, you realize it's a lot different than, number one, what we've been told about the Founding Fathers, but number two, it's a lot different than where our nation is heading. And if we're ever to get back going in the right direction, we have to know what the right direction was, what it is, and what it needs to be. And this is why studying from original documents from the Founding Fathers' original intent can be very helpful. And again, our website, wallbuilders.com, encourage people to check that out and find out more.
You guys also travel. You guys speak. This has been really great. Thank you for your time. You are just amazing. A little nudge, and the enthusiasm and the breadth of knowledge comes out just in waterfalls from you, Tim, and it's fantastic. This is the No Shame Podcast at the intersection of faith and culture, and I have a new organization, WallBuilders. They sit right there, and they are encouraging us to bring the kingdom of God on earth. Thank you for your time, Tim. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on today.
That's it. Thanks so much, everybody.
Have no shame.